Well, hello, everyone. I wish to thank David and everyone else for inviting me to be here. If I sound a little bit not quite 100% well, it's because actually I came down with the flu flying back from New York, where I've been a visiting professor at Columbia, and I had 101 fever. So while you were doing all these wonderful things, I was upstairs recovering. And I'm back well enough today to be able to share with you this look at extraordinary ideas. And fortunately, I didn't have to be here to hear the latest ideas for the content of this talk to be relevant to what you are doing. If I cough or whatever, please forgive me. Okay. We're going to be talking about extraordinary ideas and evidence and something called the five-finger test. That word is used in a simple way when we would like to teach this idea, for example, to children or to some of our distinguished colleagues. It's helpful to have an easy way to look at things. And this is dedicated, this presentation to Carl Sagan, who said, as you know, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, this is a big picture presentation, and I'm going to quote Carl again. He said, "Science is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge." And what we're going to be doing is looking at the process that I myself went through in addressing an extraordinary idea which was against the way in which I was raised, both by my parents and by Western science, and the process that I went through to come to terms with the evidence, the logic, and other factors. Now, this creature, as you probably recognize, is an ostrich, and his or her head's in the sand. Now, we have a metaphor for that. We think of when an ostrich puts its head in the sand, it's a way of engaging in denial. This is the way I was raised as a Western scientist. I was taught to specialize, to ignore things that sort of fall outside of my purview. If there are things that don't fit the accepted mode, ignore them until they are unavoidable. And ostrich thinking and ostrich science has a certain practicality. Now, contrast this with the eagle science. What's interesting about the eagle as a bird is that it is one of the highest flying birds of any creature. It will, because it's up so high, it has big picture vision. It's not kept on the ground like the ostrich. And by the way, I love ostriches. They're big birds, they got beautiful feathers and so on. But they don't see the big picture. But the other thing about the ostrich is, besides seeing the big picture, there's also what's called the eagle eye. The ostrich can see the rabbit that's a mile away. And so what happens is, we can say that the eagle, or the eagle mind, sees both the forest and the trees. We can say the eagle sees both the whole and the parts. We can also say it sees the whole and the holes. Think about this. The word whole has the word hole in it. So seeing the holes in one's theory is very important if one's going to have an honest, fair, just, responsible way to coming to conclusions. And I ended up developing this five-factor model of leading to a responsible belief. Now, none of these phenomena are going to be novel to you. What's going to be novel is our integration of them. So first of all, there is theory. Logic and theory, of which this organization spends a lot of time in terms of attempting to see whether certain frameworks can put a different perspective, in this case, the electric universe, for example. Then, of course, there's research, and there's different kinds and levels of research, and field research, and exploratory research, through parametric research, and double-blind research, and so on. There's research evidence. Well, that's a second factor. But in addition to there being theory and there's research, there are also other factors which give us increased confidence that some extraordinary idea may be true. And so the third factor I list are credible people. These are people who, independently of us, look at the logic and look at the research and come to the same conclusion that we do, giving us more sense of confidence that maybe this is a sane and responsible thing to consider. And then there's personal experiences. Now, in many areas of science, we can't have a direct personal experience. Most of us can't go to the sun and directly experience electric currents. If they're there, we have to do this indirectly and learn through others. But in other areas of science, we can have direct experience. And in one of the areas I'm going to talk to you about, that personal experience is transformative for people. But the fifth is, I say, no responsible reasons to dismiss 1 through 4. And this is where we put on our skeptical hats and we take stock and we attempt to see whether or not the first 4 are in fact justified. And if after careful consideration of these 4 that we thought were valid, we still come to the conclusion that they're valid, if all 5 have been met, then the question is, I call this the 5-finger test. FFT, not fast Fourier transform, but which some of you know from spectral analysis, okay? Now the question is, if in a given area of science all 5 of these are met, do we have a responsibility now to believe that something is true? In other words, is there a set of conditions which then lead us, in fact even require us, ethical responsibility to believe something? Now you may be wondering, do we need to have additional factors? Do we need a 6th finger, for example? And David Talbot has a finger he'd like to propose that we add to the hand. We'll leave that till later. Now, we can apply this kind of FFT to any idea in science or life in general. It is a, quote, universal perspective. And what I'm going to do is illustrate it in an area that I do know, which is very controversial. And as I'm doing this, and I'm going to do this very quickly because we don't have time to do this in any depth, you in the back of your mind can be thinking, how does the electric universe fit with all of this? And we could talk about some of this during the conversation after the break. Finally, I'd like to make a recommendation in the spirit of Warren McCulloch. He was a very distinguished neuroscientist and systems theorist. He said, do not bite my finger, look where I'm pointing. And since we're using a 5-finger test, it seems like an appropriate statement. So, what's the controversial idea that we're going to address here? And we're going to take the question of the following: the relationship between matter and mind. When Einstein was asked the question, do you believe in immortality? He replied, no, and one life is enough for me. Einstein essentially believed that matter is primary. Now contrast this with another distinguished physicist, in this case Max Planck, who said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness. For him, mind is primary. Now, people vary in the extent to which they believe either matter is primary or mind is primary. And you can think about where you currently fall in terms of your belief about which is primary, or whether you're, quote, unsure or agnostic. I was raised in no uncertain terms that number 1 was the correct response. I was brought up in an atheist home. I was raised in Western science. Everybody knows that matter is primary and mind is secondary. But as we go through this, what I want us to emphasize here is the knowledge, in this case, of the process. That what we're talking about here is not about mind or matter per se. It's about the process by which we would come to the conclusion, for example, whether mind or matter is primary. So that's our task here. Because remember, what we're dealing with is a more generic approach to developing responsible beliefs. So let's first talk about theory. Theory is very important. And of course, as you know, you've heard a lot of theoretical conversations about alternative views of the universe. And in a book called the Oxford Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality, I described the following. I'm going to take you through this in a little bit of detail. It's the only bit of detail I'll have time for here. Because if there's one thing that you walk away with here, I want you to understand how it can be that literally an entire community, a whole world of neuroscientists can currently hold a belief that is probably wrong. So I want to talk about the commonality of methods in neuroscience and electrical engineering. Now, it turns out that there are three kinds of methods that neuroscientists use to come to the conclusion that the brain creates consciousness. The first is what's called correlation. Correlation is, for example, if we place electrodes on the back of a person's head over what's called the occipital region of the brain, we record the EEG waves of electrical activity, and we have a person looking at a light or imagining a light, and you'll see increased brainwave activity going on in the back of the head. There is a correlation between what we can record from the brain and what people's conscious experience. No question about that. Number two, stimulation. And most human beings don't volunteer for this kind of experiment, but we can rip off a part of the brain, and then we can place electrodes and stimulate the visual cortex. We can now do this with magnetic stimulators, even ultrasound. And when you stimulate the occipital cortex, people report having visual experiences. So that's a second leg of a tripod pointing in the direction of a relationship, in this case between the occipital cortex and the experience of vision. And then third, there's ablation. And this, you could never get through an IRB committee. An undergraduate comes in the laboratory, you rip off the back of their head, and then you remove a piece of their occipital cortex. People will not volunteer for that, understandably so. You can do this with animals. However, we have phenomena in nature. We have injuries to the back of the head. We have diseases that affect the back of the head. And when that happens, people show selective blindness. Through the combination of correlation, stimulation, and ablation, neuroscientists come to the conclusion that the brain creates mind. Now, by the way, I can't see very clearly out here, but I'm curious, how many of you would come to that conclusion yourself? Please raise your hands, and don't be afraid to do so. There's got to be one person here. Oh, good. Oh, good. Yay! Thank you. Very good. Okay. That's what we neuroscientists do. I don't know why the rest of you don't, but that's what they do. It's interesting that you don't. Okay. Now, I started out in electrical engineering. And when I was in high school, I did some television repair. And I learned the following things. That in electrical engineering, we do correlation studies. Here's what we do. In the old days, with television sets had tubes. Some of you remember those days. We would take a probe of an oscilloscope and we would put it in the back where the tube was, and we would record the electrical activity on the oscilloscope, and we'd look to see how it correlated with what was on the screen. And we would look to see whether it was in sync or not. We would then do stimulation experiments. I literally built an ICO stimulator. And you would take a probe and you would put it where the tube was, and you'd stimulate in a particular point, and you would see clear indications on the screen. And then we would do ablation studies. We would remove a particular tube, and there would be a deficit in the particular functioning of the visual signal. Those are the three experiments we did: correlation, stimulation, and ablation. And the conclusion that we came to was that the TV creates the signals. Now, how many of you came to that conclusion, that the TV creates the signals? Well, none of us do. We know, in fact, that a television set, there's an alternative explanation that is consistent with those three sets of data, and that is the television set is an antenna receiver for those signals. So the critical question is, are either of these sets of 3 experiments necessary and sufficient conclusions using only these 3 methods? And the answer has to be no. Additional methods are required to reach a responsible conclusion about the relationship between the mind and brain. Is the brain the creator, the matter the creator of mind, or is it some sort of antenna receiver filter for mind? So, for example, there's a theory of what's called microtubules in consciousness developed by Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiology professor at the University of Arizona, and Roger Penrose, a physicist in England. And the question is, are microtubules the creators of consciousness, which is their position, or are microtubules like TVs, little antennas and receivers of consciousness? The responsible answer is, this is an open question. That's simple logic. And you see, if we don't have integrity about drawing logical inferences and understanding the limitations of logical inferences when we do science, we end up running off holding one set of beliefs versus another set of beliefs, and we're not even necessarily being accurate in their representation. So now let's talk about research. And this I can't take, everything I'm going to do now has to be very brief. By the way, is Michael Shermer here?
Yeah, I'm the one who said the brain causes the mind.
What?
I'm the only one here who said the brain causes the mind.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're here. I used to think like you. Yes. Well, I'm praying that you're going to apply the scientific method and see the bigger picture of the challenge and opportunities that we now have. Okay, research. There's a tremendous amount of research that is consistent with the hypothesis that speaks to the question using methods other than correlation, stimulation, and ablation, which points to the alternative hypothesis adopted by Max Planck and many others that maybe consciousness was separate from the brain. We held a conference to look at all of this data. A combination of my colleagues at Mario Beauregard and myself at the University of Arizona and Lisa Miller from Columbia University. We held it at Canyon Ranch a year ago. It's called the International Summit on Post-Material Science, Spirituality, and Society. We published a manifesto about openness to alternative ideas and information in science and why this was so vital for science of the future, and it always has been. We created a website called opensciences.org, which includes activities of this organization to illustrate exemplars of where people are addressing these questions, hopefully with an open mind. And there are various kinds of bodies of evidence which we can't speak to. There have been many books that have been written. As I said, this stuff we have to skim. I've also personally and my colleagues done research in some of the more controversial areas of this work, including mediumship research and other kinds of things, and written multiple books in the area. Now, by the way, some of you probably know this, that there are people who claim to be able to speak to the deceased. There are really fake mediums out there, and you can learn to become one. I certainly did not want to be fooled. By the way, can anybody find the mistake in this slide? Two what? Very good. Takes a while for most people to find this. It's not in the numbers. Anyway, we don't want to be fooled. And I certainly didn't want to be fooled. So although people forget this, I became a fake medium. I read secret books, I took a course, I'm a pretty good fake medium. So you could design experiments to eliminate the procedures that the fake mediums use. We have a motto in the laboratory, which is, if it's real, it will be revealed, and if it's fake, we'll find the mistake. Science is in the process of being able to not only support a theory, but also to be able to show if a theory does not hold. We do not have time to go through this. But we, in 2007, published what's called a triple-blind experiment with medium. The gold standard in biomedical research is double-blind. We took it one step further to add additional controls. And even under those very stringent conditions, we got clearly statistical results shown on virtually all of the mediums. And now a quintuple-blinded experiment using mediums has been published. Now, can skilled professional magicians reproduce these triple-blind experiments in the laboratory? Well, of course, I was interested in that, even though I had myself training in this. And I brought a consensus group of people together, and the consensus, they said, was no, they couldn't do this. Summary conclusion, based on the evidence, is that some mediums are real, meaning that they are not getting this information by any of the conventional procedures that we're taught to be a fake medium. Now, I wish to remind you, what matters here is the process, not the content per se. The issue is me not convincing you, pro or con, whether you accept the evidence. The issue here is about this five-fingered approach to when do we change our minds? When do we come to a responsible conclusion? And I also remind you of my friend, scientist friend, Warren McCulloch, who said, "Do not bite my finger. Look where I am pointing." Then there's credible people. And because for me, what I discovered was, as I was doing this kind of research, that it was not enough for me to see both the logic and the theory and the evidence. It was really important to me to see that there were other people who would independently come to the same conclusion that I do. It's one of the ways that you can be assured that you're not just yourself coming to a false conclusion. And I set up 7 criteria for what I call identifying credible people. And they are that a person is successful, and these can be measured in various kinds of ways, that they are smart. Can you recognize that, gentlemen? That they are skeptical. They're clearly questioning people. They don't just take things at face value. They look for alternative explanations. They are sophisticated. They don't see things in simple terms. They can look for paradox. They can look for subtleties. They can look for exceptions to the rule. They are savvy. They've been around the block. They know what they're doing. They have experience. They are straight as being honest and trustworthy. I know a lot of people who meet the first 5 categories in spades. They're called politicians. But just because a politician tells you something, and they're successful, smart, sometimes skeptical, sophisticated, and can be savvy, they're not necessarily straight. And finally, the person is sane. Now, I was trained in clinical psychology. I know how to make these kinds of diagnoses. So are there any people that meet these kinds of criteria? The answer is yes, there's a lot of them, and I've come to meet them over the years. They include, for example, a woman by the name of Janice Heafy-Durham, just published a book based on her personal experiences, which were independently witnessed by her engineering husband, and they took multiple photographs. This is a woman who meets all 7 criteria in spades. She was the senior vice president of the LA Times. She was in charge of thousands of people. She became the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Sacramento Bee. This woman is nobody's fool. Or Suzanne Giesman, a woman who was a distinguished Navy commander. She became the assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the period of time of 9/11. She was in the last plane flying with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Long, complicated story, but she ended up changing her mind about what she had been taught, now writes books and works in this area. Now, you may say, well, gee, maybe we need more criteria. Maybe we need an 8th or a 9th. That's not the point. The point is you can find credible people who hold on to a given belief. And if they exist, that's a 3rd reason for considering a belief as being true. Then there are direct personal experiences. We've already said that in many areas of science we can't have direct personal experiences. By the way, I am not a medium. I do not see spirit. I do not hear a spirit. One of my colleagues affectionately refers to me as the Helen Keller of afterlife research. But I spent a lot of time with people who do, and I've also worked with technology. If you're interested in this, you can see a documentary called The Life After Death Project that illustrates one such journey in real life where you can trust the integrity of the people involved. Okay. But the last thing here is getting back to the beginning, and then it's time for me to stop. And that is, to what extent can we actually look back at the logic theory research, the people involved, and personal experiences that people have had? And is there reason to seriously question them or dismiss them? Now, as a scientist, I deeply believe in skepticism, and I always like to get people who hold different points of view than I do, because they're going to see things that I don't see. In fact, early on when I was doing this research, I created what I called the FDA. The FDA stood for the Friendly Devil's Advocate Committee. And what's really amusing is because the work was so controversial, some of the people, including tenured professors at the University of Arizona, did not feel comfortable being listed on the FDA, even though they were being critical of it, because there was guilt through association. And I had to make the committee anonymous. Now, that's a sad state of science, when the people who are being skeptical and really trying to, quote, rip things apart for the best and the highest good can't even be allowed to do so. So I looked at those 4 areas of work very carefully, and I encourage the Electric Universe community to do this rigorously with everything that you believe and claim. Don't let it all out. Really be critical and reevaluate everything that you do. And so, for example, it turns out that there are 4 core criticisms in the skeptical community in the area that I work, all of which are important to raise, and each one happens to fit each of the fingers. So the first kind of statement we'll hear is that something is scientifically impossible, that theory or laws rule something out. It's a valid question. You should ask that question. Okay? However, I remind you that the commonalities in the methods of neuroscience and electrical engineering clearly indicate to us that all the data in neuroscience is consistent with an alternative interpretation of the brain. These experiments, as important, as valuable as they are, do not allow us logically to draw a definitive conclusion. So, is it theoretically impossible based on the data? The answer is not true. Then we look to, well, here's claims such as, there's no credible research, and the explanations that can handle them are conventional. You don't need anything anomalous. Well, is that true? Well, I remind you, for example, of the triple-blind experiment we published in 2007. These are highly credible experiments. They pass all peer review. There's no faults that we can find in the experimental design. And they rule out the conventional explanations. They require us to entertain alternative explanations. So that's not true. Then we'll hear things such as, the believers are not credible. You know, people who believe in this kind of stuff, you're just weird, or you're flakes, or you don't think very carefully. And by the way, there are people who are weird. There are people who don't think very clearly, and so on. However, I remind you that when I apply the 7 criteria for successful people, for credible people, I find people in all walks of life, including CEOs and physicians and professors and so on, who are independently coming to this similar conclusion. So therefore, that criticism is not true. And then finally, that all experiencers are invalid. That people who have these direct experiences, we can't trust subjective judgment. Well, the truth is we can't trust it under many circumstances. And there's all kinds of social psychological research that documents it. But that doesn't mean that every single bit of it can't be trusted, and therefore we should throw out our personal experiences. No, we just have to be more discerning. And I remind you of this. So, what happens if there's no good reason, no responsible set of reasons to reject the first 4? My question to you is, when is it time to change our minds? Because the journey that I've been on personally is not just how much theory do you have to have, and not just how much data do you have to have, but what's the total set of conditions that would foster us to hold responsible beliefs. When is it time to change our minds? This requires that we adopt an eagle perspective. The problem with practicing ostrich science as opposed to eagle science is that the ostrich scientists are not aware that they're ostrich scientists, and when you got different groups of ostriches arguing with each other, they're looking at cross purposes. Now, is the answer just professional skepticism? The answer is no. Just as some mediums are not real, some skeptics are, quote, not real. And it's valuable for us to be skeptical about everything, including skepticism itself. So there are now websites about skepticism. Some of you may have heard the quote, moderation in everything, including moderation. Well, I suggest to you that we have skepticism about everything, including professional skepticism. Skepticism is fantastic as long as it's done responsibly and balanced in the totality of how we humans evolve. Carl Sagan wrote, "It is the tension between creativity and skepticism that has produced the stunning and unexpected findings of science." He also said, "When Kepler found his long-cherished belief did not agree with the most precise observation, he accepted the uncomfortable fact. He preferred the hard truth to his dearest illusions. That is the heart of science." It's a very powerful statement. It is one I ask myself always. Each of us has a long-cherished belief. And they're dear to us. But do we really prefer the hard truth to our dearest illusions? Can each of us think, under what conditions would we change our mind about something which we hold dear? That's the question. By the way, I think humans can rise to the occasion to do that. We just should be encouraged to do so. Now, you know the history of science, right? The earth looks flat, therefore it's flat. Everybody believed that. That's how it looks. We now know that's not true. The sun looks like it revolves around the earth, therefore the sun revolves around the earth. Everybody believed that. The evidence supported it. We now know it's not true. Objects look and feel solid, therefore objects are solid. But in a deep sense, not true. The vacuum looks like it's empty, therefore it is empty. We even use the word vacuum. We now know it's teeming with the light from trillions of stars, photons crisscrossing in all directions, everywhere. It's not true. Well, it looks like consciousness depends upon a functioning brain. Therefore, the brain creates consciousness. That's how it looks. But maybe it's not true. It looks like consciousness stops after the brain dies. Therefore, when the brain dies, consciousness dies too. It's not true. So at what point do revolutions occur? Well, the big revolutions really require that we think outside the box, that we go outside what our common senses necessarily tell us. It requires stepping up and seeing the big picture, and it requires seeing all the details as well as the big picture, the forest as well as the trees. And if I may, I'll just take you through a little journey that I went on, and then I appreciate the extra time. There's a big challenge in changing one's belief, and as I was trying to think about how I've gone through this process, I've gone through 10 different stages. First of all, we start examining the old belief. We start wondering, is this really as ironclad as we thought it was? We start questioning it, and we have different degrees of questioning this old belief. we then start getting confused about what to believe about the old belief, because there's now paradoxes. We start experiencing stress about the possibility of changing our minds about the old belief. It can be disturbing. Then there are degrees of maybe entertaining a, quote, new belief, some alternative belief, an NB. We then develop fears of the new belief and its professional and personal consequences, and I've had those big time. Then there are degrees of accepting the new belief, and there are different levels by which we can start to begin to accept it. Then we go a process of grieving the old belief, the loss of the old belief. There's actually a grieving process. At least I went through it. Then there's integrating the new belief into one's professional and personal life. And then finally, just possibly, we can celebrate the new belief. I'm looking at this because it's I hadn't seen the slides being prepared before. But anyway, there's two guys, and they look really nice. I'm glad they're there. And that's the first time I'm seeing them. But thank you, Albert, and thank you, Max, for the two different perspectives on all of this. But this is the one that I wanted to have here. And this is as follows. I believe in science education. I really believe in the process of science. And I believe that those of us who have the privilege to call ourselves scientists have an ethical and moral responsibility to the profession and to society. I read an interesting book called The Moral Arc. The author will be speaking next. And wonderful book. And one of the things that he carefully points out is that although, yes, there are horrific things taking place in humanity today, and there are things that we should not be proud of, on the whole, we have become an increasingly moral species. The data clearly supports this. And that science has played an important role in the evolution of our capacity for morality. And I believe that to make statements like that puts one in a position of great responsibility, because one has to walk the talk. And that any of us who are going to be standing up for new and challenging ideas, it's not just so much who wins, and it's not even so much what idea, what belief, what principle turns out to be the one that's accepted, but it's the process of coming to those conclusions, doing it fairly, doing it creatively, doing it cautiously, doing it with integrity, doing it responsibly. That's the bigger question. And that's why I felt so privileged to be able to be here, and so glad my fever broke yesterday, so that I could help contribute to the process of this organization potentially becoming a model for responsible, innovative, and challenging ideas. There aren't too many groups that raise these kinds of questions even, who are doing, innovative science or creative science. We don't even have the privilege of having a science-minded laboratory person and a skeptically minded science person here on the same stage with a sociologist of science to carefully address these kinds of questions. And the truth is, I don't care whether the mind comes first, really. And I don't care whether the sun involves electricity or not. I mean, sure, I might have some preferences, but I don't care. What I personally care about is that we can get a responsible answer to those questions, and we do so in a manner that we can be proud. And so I think this is a time of great opportunity and gratitude. I wish to thank the organizers and you for this opportunity, and I look forward to the future with great hope. Thank you.